And welcome back to Coast with our special guest now, Nick Rosen, Off the Grid, Inside the Movement for more space, less government, and true independence in modern America. Get ready for this on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, let's bring in Nick Rosen, an award-winning documentary maker, journalist, broadcaster. He's made films for CBS's 60 Minutes, PBS's great Frontline program, and has written for The Washington Post and Reuters. Born and based in London, he has often lived and worked here in the United States. He only wants to know what the future holds. He comes to America. Over the past 2 decades, he's been a teaching assistant at the Georgetown University Philosophy Department, a journalist in San Francisco, and a documentary filmmaker in New York. Nick is an off-grid expert, editing the website off-grid.net. And since 1994, he's been off the grid part-time. Here he is at Coast to Coast. Hey, Nick, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Good
to be here.
You too. Tell me a little bit about what off the grid means.
It means living independently, mainly independently of the utility companies, providing your own power. It does not mean living in the Stone Age. It's not about bushcraft. It's about generating your own power, your own water, dealing with your own waste, probably as part of a community, not living on your own like a hermit. But it also goes further than just that literal sense, and it's about somehow being more self-reliant, being less dependent upon the system, perhaps realizing that the system isn't really protecting us anymore and we have to look after ourselves.
Was that your motivation here, Nick, or was it also, cost savings, which happens, doesn't it?
To be honest, in my own case, it was cost savings that first led me to go off the grid. I found a beautiful spot in a kind of millionaires enclave. I really wanted to be there in the Mediterranean in Spain. But, of course, I couldn't afford it. But for $7,000, I bought a shepherd's hut and a few acres of olive grove. And to my amazement, I found it was really quite easy, and I was very happy there, and it was very comfortable once you'd introduced a little bit of technology, a few solar panels and some rainwater harvesting. And it was, even for somebody as impractical as myself, it really was quite possible to do that.
And you probably realized after a while you didn't need that millionaire's mansion, did you?
Well, I had the view. I have the millionaire's view. I still got the place, and I can sort of look down to the Mediterranean across the olive groves without any of the hassle and without some huge property that I have to maintain and pay for and clean.
Absolutely. So that started you on this mission. And I would guess, Nick, you became more and more educated as you began to investigate this, didn't you?
Exactly. I started. I'm a writer, obviously, and wanted to be able to do my computing and get on the internet up at the top of this mountain. And it was then that I discovered this idea of living off the grid. I hadn't really thought of it before, and learned that there was technology and lots of other people doing it, and got solar panels to charge up my laptop and wireless broadband so that I could be on the web. So you can be off the grid, but on the cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you say you're off the grid, is this primarily then, and would it be in people's living environments as opposed to in their office, going to a store, or would that include that too?
It can do. I mean, for most people, I'm lucky enough not to have to go to an office to work. But, and a lot of people these days, of course, can work anywhere. Knowledge workers of all sorts. Designers can just have their computer wherever they are and then just send it over the internet. But craftspeople as well, whether you're a carpenter or a shoemender or something like that. But for the people who need, to go into an office or work in a restaurant, there are a lot of those now which are completely off the grid. I mean, in writing the book, I went all over America and I visited restaurants that were off the grid and food production units of all sorts that were running in the middle of the countryside with solar power and wind power.
And we're going to get into this, but people can actually do this in their own homes, can't they?
Absolutely. I think the first step to doing it in your own home and getting rid of that evil utility bill is to reduce your energy consumption, to realize that you don't have to change your lifestyle hardly at all to use much less energy. For example, you can watch TV, you can watch a big screen TV and have your washing machine and your cooker, but you just can't run them all at the same time.
Ah, that makes sense, too. You know, I remember when I was a kid, and I used to flash the old light switch up and down, up and down. My mother always used to get after me going, that's costing us more money. I don't know if that's true or not, Nick, but she got me to conserve.
Well, that's right. Well, it's our parents' generation that, of course, were the ones that wanted to make do and mend, that post-war generation. But these days, I think one of the reasons that off-grid does seem attractive now is that we've all become rather consumerist and greedy, and we're beginning to get a bit tired of it. We've realized that you don't really need that many pairs of pants or TVs or radios in your house, that we went on a bit of a consumer splurge in the 80s and 90s.
Is Al Gore off the grid, do you know?
I do know that he was not off the grid. George Bush was off the grid, and in fact, my website, offgrid.net, was we broke that story originally, that his place in Crawford was off the grid.
Oh, my gosh. Okay, so Bush was off the grid, Al Gore wasn't.
I'm afraid so, yeah. And also, it has to be said, Al Gore did nothing for the environment in his 8 years in the White House.
That is amazing. What other folks of well-known notoriety have been living off the grid?
Well, one that won't surprise you is Daryl Hannah.
Right. She's been on the show before.
She has she? Okay.
Yes.
Well, then you'll know about her. And then there's Jesse Ventura.
Mm-hmm.
He's off the grid. And there's a rather lovely woman, Vera Farmiga, who's in that show Up in the Air, in that recent movie Up in the Air.
Yeah.
And she has got a bee farm in upstate New York, which is off the grid. I think Woody Harrelson has a family home in Hawaii. And after 2001, of course, after 9/11, a lot of the stars did kind of get themselves a bug-out location, as they call it, but not the sort of bug-out location you or I could afford. I think Leonardo DiCaprio got a 100-acre island in Belize, and Johnny Depp got a little Pond Cay in the Bahamas, and Mad Max, Mel Gibson, paid for another island in the Fijis. But that's not what I mean by going off the grid. I mean, it's all fine to think that you and your retinue could go and exist in splendid isolation, but actually I think it would get pretty depressing after a while. What you want to do is be part of an actual society, a group. And so going off the grid, the sort of people I visited around America are living in places where there might be hundreds of households off the grid in that immediate area.
I was going to say, can a community of, let's say, 200 homes or 500 homes, can they develop a system to go off the grid?
The answer is very simply is yes, and it's probably the ideal amount, 200 to 500 homes, because that way you're going to have, within the people who are living in that region, you're going to have all the skills you need, whether it's plumbing or electrics or lawyers, whatever you might need, that social group might have it. And you're going to be able to bulk purchase things like solar panels at a much better price than you could get if you were just supplying one or two households. And you might get one or two big wind turbines, which are much more reliable than the little domestic wind turbines.
Nick, I think the sun may force a lot of people off the grid because one day we're going to get hit with an X-flare and it's going to cook the grid and we're going to be up the creek.
Yeah, well, that's if the greedy utility companies don't cook it first.
Exactly, which could also happen.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk specifically about North America, Canada, the United States.
Yeah.
How is the power system working today? How does that work?
Well, it's an amazing feat of engineering, the contemporary American power system. And it was put in place, 100 years ago. And to put it it's most simple, the way it works is you have very, very large power stations, a few of them, transporting electricity all around the country. And it doesn't work very well. This technology was invented 100 years ago. It is now rather out of date. It's very inefficient. So if you put oil and coal in, that's the input, and the output is you switching on your light at home.
Yeah.
A huge amount of energy is lost right in the power station. probably about 50% of the actual energy value of that oil or coal is lost in the production. And it goes out as heat, which isn't even trapped. They're not even collecting that heat and turning that into more energy. Then another 20-30% is lost in the transmission lines, just in the vast distances it's traveling, especially since the deregulation of electricity in the 90s, which led to phenomenon like Enron. There's a huge amount of trading going on, energy trading. So they're generating the energy not just in order to supply their consumers, but also to trade it across the border with the next door electricity company. So another 20% is lost there. And then another percentage is lost once it gets to the home or the office in the inefficiency of the appliances that were designed really partly in order to use a lot of power, because the power companies were the ones selling the power, were also the ones designing and selling the appliances.
That's right. Especially in the older days. I mean, Now it's all over, but you're right. You can go to your electric utility or your gas company, and you can get an appliance. They'll put it on your bill. They'll put it on your monthly bill.
Yeah. And, these days, of course, it'll be energy rated, and it will be reasonably efficient, but that's only because of the huge fuss that there's been. And also, of course, there's the whole issue of energy security and wanting to end the dependence on foreign oil that's made us more aware of energy efficiency. But back in the early days of the grid, it was quite the opposite. There was every incentive for the utility companies to have as inefficient appliances as possible.
You're from the United Kingdom. Why are you interested in the grid system in the movement here in the United States?
Well, it's partly because, the UK, although it sort of looms large at the moment in people's minds, is a tiny place the size of Kansas with a very big population, about 60 million.
Yeah.
And London has got the second financial center after New York. So it's a tiny island, very overpopulated, with a hugely powerful central government in the capital city. So as a result, you can do almost nothing in Britain unless it goes through the system and through the center. And so my interest in living off the grid and helping others to do so is not getting very far in the UK. It's just the culture is against it. Everything's centralized. There's no way that you can just buy a woodland, for example, and move into it and live there. So the laws in Britain are like the tightest parts of America. If you go into really wealthy parts of America, like outside San Francisco, then the land is incredibly expensive, partly because the pot growers own so much of it, and you can't really do what you want there. It's very controlled. But you can go to other huge parts of America, New Mexico or Texas or Florida, where you can operate very freely. You can just set yourself up with some land, build a home for $25,000, put in a really good quality power system for another $10,000. So the answer to your question is it's all possible in America. The culture supports it and fosters it.
Are there tax breaks for putting in these kinds of systems, Nick?
The tax breaks in America are not so great as they are if you're on the grid. So if you're already on the grid and you put these systems in, you get a kind of double tax break because you're allowed to sell your power back to the grid.
Uh-huh.
And I would highly recommend people to look into that, especially if they can get together with the rest of people in their street and do a bulk purchase so that they're not paying retail.
How would that work?
Well, same as as if you're bulk purchasing rice or anything else, you can just go to a good supplier and say, listen, there's 12 of us households or 20. Please give us a price for the whole job.
Oh,
I see
what you mean.
Isn't just buying the solar panels; it's also installing them and making sure they're working properly.
But I mean, how do you give the power back to the utility?
Okay,
company?
Right. Well, it is very regulated, and quite rightly so, for safety reasons. You have to use just the right equipment that's been approved, and that adds to the price. But you simply install the same solar power setup as you would anyway, and you just connect it up to your fuse box, and it just literally runs the meter backwards as the power is going from your solar panels back into the grid. It's just one of the miracles of electricity. It works.
That is amazing. And you get a check, or how did?
Well, you should get a check, but no, it doesn't work like that. All you're allowed to do most places is zero out your bill. You're not allowed to kind of actually make a profit.
You can. Okay.
Yeah, that's where the odds are stacked against you, and it's a bit ridiculous, really. But there's that. You can actually sell them the power back. There are also various other incentives that vary by state to do with, the amount of, to do with the fact that as a householder with your own energy, you're saving the utility company from having to build another power station kind of thing.
How much would it cost to do just one house to the point where you could get your own power and also feed back on the grid?
It's a bit subjective always, but the first thing to say is it depends on changing your behavior a little bit. Like I was saying earlier, it's about planning for the peaks. So you don't want to have a peak where you're running your washing machine and your air conditioning and your TV and your cooker all at the same time, because that would just drain even the best equipment.
Right. Okay.
So to answer your question, I think if you modify your behavior and you're careful and husband your resources, then for a typical four-person family, $25,000 should be more than adequate. And if you're paying $1,000 or $1,500 per year at the moment, then that means that after 15 years you've paid off the cost.
And you got it for free after that, other than a little maintenance, I would guess.
Exactly.
Always when there's a heat wave, for example, we always get these warnings from power companies that, you have to conserve. We might not be able to supply you the kind of power you want if it's a heat wave that continues. Is that the same thing, basically? There's a drain on the system?
Exactly. And there's no reason, as consumers, we ought to be interested in helping out at a time like that and making sure there isn't a blackout. And a lot of the lessons that you learn from living off the grid about how to conserve energy could come into play then, and everybody could be applying them. So, for example, running your washing machine late in the night when you're not using anything else and everybody's gone to bed, or running your dishwasher late at night as well. Turning down your air conditioning, perhaps just having the air conditioning in just one room instead of the whole house. And, of course, if you're really planning for the long term, trying to design your house so that it has cooling breezes running through it, just using the ancient wisdom of the Pueblo Indians, of other early settlers obviously had before the days of electricity and air conditioning, of making sure you design your house so there's windows open at the front and the back, and the breezes run through them.
Exactly. I assume there are some companies that will work with you on setting up an off-grid system for you?
Absolutely. I mean, it's impossible to recommend one, of course, because they're all so local. There are no national companies, and in each case you have to find a local one. Best to try and find somebody who's already off the grid and has that knowledge and skill, rather than somebody who's used to doing it for the grid-connected house. You can go onto the off-grid website. We've got a free service called Land Buddy. And on Land Buddy, you can just put in what it is you're looking for, whether it's land or some assistance in setting your solar panels up, and put in your approximate location on the map and find other people in your area who are doing the same thing, share skills and cut costs.
Are there some communities in the United States that are off the grid now?
Many, many communities. I mean, hundreds, thousands of communities who are off the grid now. From Big Bend, Texas, to the Florida Keys, to upstate New York, to Northern California, just so many communities. And they vary from people who were never on the grid, just good old boys, who are backwoodsmen, as you might call them, to the old back to the landers from the 70s, the old hippie movement. So I visited one place in Ukiah, a big old ranch that had been subdivided into 200 or 300 homes, where everybody's off the grid, everybody's living a very comfortable life. There's builders and wine growers. And, of course, in Northern California, there's a very substantial number of pot growers. And I think, by this November, they might all be legal. At the moment, of course, they're semi-legal, a lot of them. They're growing medical marijuana.
Yeah,
they have their medical permits, which they laminate and place facing upwards in the fields, in the cannabis fields, so that the helicopters can see them conveniently.
Nick, stay with us. We're going to come back, talk with you about some of the strangest off-grid experiences you've had. And I understand you've got some experience with the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderbergs. We'll talk about that, too. And our special guest, Nick Rosen, as we talk about Off the Grid. Next hour, we'll take your phone calls right here on Coast to Coast AM. Nick, what is one of your strangest off-grid experiences you've had? And I'm sure you've had a few.
I sure have. I guess one of the strangest must have been my visit to the Mennonites, the Old Order Mennonites, the Amish, in Kentucky. And I went to visit a guy who has the most successful engineering company. He's got a turnover of about $3 million a year, and they do not use electricity in this engineering company, which makes complex metal structures for industry in the Northeast. And so to generate power, they use horses. And I walked onto his ranch, and there was a horse on an escalator, basically. That was like a treadmill that they'd built out of wood, which they'd grown and cut themselves. And there was this horse walking on this treadmill, and the treadmill turned a lever, and the lever turned a motor in their cool box. They didn't have a fridge. They had like a large Coleman's cool box, which kept their meat and milk fresh. So that was probably the oddest single thing.
You have also had an experience writing about the Bilderbergs, the power elite groups, a lot of which, I think are tied into this electrical mess we're in right now and power mess we're in. How did you get into that? How did you begin to investigate them?
I guess I spotted it was a phenomenon in the 80s. This was a long time ago. And I took the academic route. I'd been an academic in Washington, D.C. Excuse me. And a lot of the high-powered academics get invited to these meetings because they want the information that these guys and women have got. So I went and talked to academics who'd been there, and I was always asking the same question: what specific policies were specifically introduced or influenced by the Bilderberg and Trilateral Commission? And through the academics, I managed to get invited to some of the meetings and met some of these power brokers. I think I ran across David Rockefeller in the men's room at the Council on Foreign Relations. It was not a good career move, of course, but annoying some of the world's most powerful people didn't do me any favors.
No, not at all.
But I was pleased to be able to do it and expose some of the things they were up to.
That's probably why it wasn't a great career move. You exposed them. But
right.
And they're out there. To some people, Nick, who would say, oh, come on, there's not a power elitist group out there. What would you say to them?
I'd say that it's just like, in your hometown. There's going to be a Rotary Club. There's going to be a little club somewhere for the guys that run the place where the local officials meet the local businessmen and keep everything cozy. And it's just like that at that level. It's all about access and networking. If the head of GE has a tax problem, he doesn't sort of whine to his accountant. He goes and sees the Treasury Secretary.
Yeah.
But we can't do that.
No, we can't do that at all.
And nor is it transparent. It's not very easy to find out that meeting has taken place or what was discussed.
What is their motive? What are they looking for? Control, power, more?
A combination of things. One thing they're looking for is to just cover up the incompetence, of the entire system. It's just to kind of keep the whole edifice creaking along, rather than accept that it's really not fit for purpose. I mean, at the moment we've got a global financial system which is like a giant Ponzi scheme, where we're always mortgaging the future to pay for the present.
Yeah.
We've got an energy system. Everything is dependent upon our energy system, and the energy system is dependent upon foreign oil and a completely polluting and inefficient production and distribution network. So really, if you look at energy and finance, of course, they should be changed, but it's not in the interests of the people who currently run the system to change it, so they have to keep it creaking along. So really, I see these meetings as like crisis meetings, which take place in order to kind of keep patching the system, keep it going, and keep those in power, of course, or in power, because that's what they want. Is as anybody would, if you're in power, you want to stay in power.
Do they want this to be long-lasting or just as long as they're still alive?
I could not really answer that. From my meetings with them, I'd say that they genuinely have both motives. There is self-interest is the number one motive, But there is also a feeling that they would like to do some good in the world. Of course, we'd all love to do some good in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, when GE first started, back in the late 19th, early 20th century, the people who were running GE at the time, they created this system, the electrical system we now have, in order to further the profits of GE. But at the same time, they truly believed that what they were doing was setting up a more rational way, a more rational order, a more rational system. And in fact, they genuinely believed that really, if the government was run along the lines of GE, it would be a better world. Now, they believed it. They were sincere. That doesn't mean they were right.
True. But it all comes down to who's in charge. Did you like these people?
No, I didn't actually. I mean, I did not warm to them, not one of them. I found them to be cold. I'm talking about today's, environmental, today's trilateralists or Bilderbergers. I found them on the whole to be cold and closed and not very spontaneous. Everything was very carefully guarded and there was no real openness, and that's what I would have liked to have seen, was some openness. I was allowed into some of the meetings, but in a controlled way and only into certain parts of certain meetings.
Do you think they acted this way because you were around, or do you think that that's really who they are?
I think that's who they are. I mean, they're people who kind of, walk around with a lot of secrets, and
they laugh at things we don't laugh about, I bet, Nick.
Yeah, and scowl at things we laugh about.
Yeah.
I mean, this current thing with BP and the oil tragedy, this guy, Tony Hayward, is just the fall guy. I mean, he's only been there a short while.
Yeah, and they got him today.
Yeah, he was foolish enough to put himself in the front line, which was a big mistake. But the real guy, I mean, BP are one of the main Bilderberg supporters. They finance something called the Successor Generation, which is the part of Bilderberg that looks to try and groom future leaders. And BP sponsors that. And the guy before Tony Hayward was John Brown, Lord Brown, who had to resign because he committed, perjury. So he had to resign as head of BP. But the British government has now brought him back as their cost-cutting expert, basically to create some other mess.
Jeez.
Because it's the cost-cutting at BP which has caused all this in the first place.
Is he working for government? Is he so well off he doesn't need a check? What's he doing?
Yes, to both of those. He's been brought into government, I think, on little or no pay, to advise. Instead of being brought in to clear up the BP mess, which would have been a very sensible job to give him.
Right.
They brought him in to make the same mistakes he made at BP, but on behalf of the whole country.
What's the mood about BP in your country, in the United Kingdom?
Well, it's the wrong mood. I think that the mood in Britain about BP is a feeling that somehow America's being unfair to BP.
Because it's a British company?
Because, well, it's not even a British company, don't forget. It's a British and an American company, but it's much more important in the British economy because the British economy is much smaller.
Right.
So BP is about 50-50 British and American these days. But BP provides £1 in every 6 of the British pension funds.
That's huge.
It looms large in people's lives here. But frankly, they've lost the plot. The leadership at BP lost the plot some years ago, and they're ready to be taken over. And it's what they deserve. That's the law of capitalism.
Yeah, I think so. As a matter of fact, as they begin to divest, sell off some of their assets, somebody's going to come and gobble them up.
Yeah.
Maybe an Exxon, who knows? But Shell.
Well, yeah.
Somebody.
But, it turns out that they all had the same mistakes. They all had the same flaws in their safety processes. It's just that BP had been cutting longer and harder than the rest of them.
Well, let's tie all this together now, Nick, with the off-grid movement and then these trilateralists, these Bilderbergs. There's a connection here, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. Because as the trilateralists try harder and harder to create larger and larger government and make everything more centralized, it's natural and inevitable that those of us who are not, invited to the party and sitting at the top table are going to want to pull in the other direction. And if you're in America, you do have that option to just turn your back on very large government and just say, I don't need to accept this in my life, and join into an off-grid community where your need for money is much lower, because once you've got your land and you've built a house and you've got your energy supply and you're possibly growing some food, or your neighbors are, then suddenly you just don't need the large salary to pay the mortgage and buy the car and commute that you needed, in the present lifestyle. So all of a sudden you find you're much more independent from the system and able to be much more self-reliant together with your community. Again, I keep stressing it's not something you can just do as an individual family.
Well, you probably can, but it's probably not efficient, right?
Sorry, you can if you're some kind of a hero. I personally couldn't, but there are people who I admire enormously who seem to be able to fix anything, kind of MacGyver types. Yeah, sure, they can do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And these trilateralists know that if they begin to lose control over you, that power, then they begin to lose everything. And that's probably one of the reasons they're fighting this.
It is the reason they're fighting. And, of course, the most important thing that we're supposed to do now to be good citizens is to be good consumers. Keep spending, keep buying more plastic stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead of realizing what is growing and dawning upon more and more people is that these material possessions do not bring happiness or satisfaction or anything. They are pointless. I mean, when you've got one radio, do you really need another? Do you really need more? Every so often, of course, you've got to upgrade your radio, but you do not really need a radio in every room or a TV in every room. When you've got 4 pairs of pants, do you need another 4 pairs of pants? But we all have fallen for it. We've all got houses full and cupboards full of stuff we don't use.
Or 90 pairs of shoes.
Yeah.
Or whatever. But I don't know. That's how they've marketed themselves to people, and people have gone that way.
Yeah, but it wasn't inevitable. It could have been different, and it still can be different. And I'm not advocating that everybody ought to go and live off-grid. I'm advocating that everybody should realize that they do have that genuine option, that it really is a solution. It's not impractical. It's not a return to the Stone Age. It's something you can make a choice for yourself and your family and your community. You can do that. You're not going to be uncomfortable. You're not going to, lose your connection with the modern world if you do it.
Nick, how big is this off-grid movement?
Hard to measure for sure, but I spent a long time trying to work that out and talking to other people who knew and talking to people in the solar panel industry. And I estimate it's at least 750,000 households. So that means well over 1 million people living off-grid now in America and growing at 10 to 15% a year.
That's fantastic.
It is, and that growth could increase quite substantially if one of a number of factors was to happen. One is just a sharp reduction in the cost of solar panels and that kind of thing. And another would be a sharp increase in the price of oil, which we're all expecting because oil production is peaking and China and India are expanding massively. And that's going to force the price up, and that's going to force us to become less dependent on oil. How
efficient are solar panels?
They're not efficient. But on the other hand, I've just pointed out nor are power stations efficient either.
Right.
But they only transfer about 15% of the actual sunlight that hits them into electricity. But that's
can that
a scientific
change?
Fact. But nevertheless, you get enough of them, you can still run a house.
Can that change? Can it
yes,
get
there's
better?
all sorts of clever stuff going on right now to develop the next generation of solar panels. They've got kind of mirrors embedded in the solar panels now, which bounce the sunlight back onto the panels to try and double the efficiency. And if they were to double the efficiency to 30%, then solar panels would become extraordinarily powerful things on everybody's home.
What about, and I've heard this as a possibility, that satellites would be sent into space that were large mirrors. They'd unfold. They'd be huge. And they can beam sunlight in a very dedicated, radiated way right down to the planet. And maybe, it would get captured into some kind of capacitor system. Is that doable?
Well, I must admit I haven't heard that one. It's certainly, it's off-grid, all right.
Yeah, it sure is.
I have heard very similar ideas here on Earth, putting huge mirrors on one side of a mountain in order to bring sunlight into the valley opposite. And all of that is very possible. Whether it's possible from space, I don't know.
As a matter of fact, I think somebody had an idea to light up a city at night with sunlight. You know, you would beam it down and, you know, you wouldn't need lights in a city anymore.
Well, that would have all sorts of freakish effects on people's mentalities, I think.
Absolutely. I think we need the difference between sunlight and darkness.
We do, and there's not enough darkness in society. You know, we light everything the whole time, and of course, you know, safety is an issue and so on. But the result is we're almost like we're scared of the dark as a culture.
Are you glad you've gone in this direction, and how far will you go?
Well, how far will I go? I will certainly end up living off the grid full time permanently. Because
That's the goal.
I found it to be so comfortable and convenient, and it also gives you the freedom to go anywhere. You don't you're no longer constrained by where the grid is. You learn that you can be comfortable anywhere on this earth. Well, not the Arctic or so on, but you know, anywhere reasonable. And I will continue basically to help anybody who wants to find their way to go off the grid and to build off-grid communities and to try and get the rules and regulations loosened so that it's easier to go off-grid, because it's still something that people encounter opposition when they try to do it. Existing householders are a bit worried about their property values. Rural areas don't want to get too crowded. But the fact is our population is expanding. We've got to go somewhere. What
% of your roof would have to be solar panels? Is it just a portion, the whole thing?
Well, at the moment, just a portion. I mean, you know, partly because of the cost of solar panels. But eventually, the cost will come right down. And, yeah, your roof will be a solar panel, as long as it's south-facing.
Yeah, okay. That's the important.
By the way, that's another thing that off-grid does kind of bring back into play some ancient wisdom, the stuff that we all knew before the grid came along, such as that when you're building a home, you orient it so that it's facing southwest, so that you get the benefit of the sun, but that you don't get blasted out by it.
True. Now, what happens if you're stuck with 22 cloudy days in a row?
Yeah. Well, that's always an issue. I'm afraid then you're going to be relying on either a generator or possibly a wind turbine, but you know, they can be unreliable wind turbines. So yeah, it's not a religion. We're not doing this as some sort of game to see how many days we can go by only using renewable energy. The answer is you have to have a backup generator, a couple of $1,000s at the most, possibly a lot less than that.
Do they have a good
generator, and you have your gasoline, and that's what you do.
Do you have a capacitor system yet for this that would store your energy, and you use it later when you want to?
Well, capacitors, we're using that term technically because there is some very interesting research going on now into the next generation of batteries using capacitors.
Yeah.
But that hasn't gone mainstream yet. So right now, it's batteries. And the battery, of course, has come a remarkably short way in the last 100 years. It's extraordinary how little the battery has developed.
That's true. Nick, we're going to take this break. We're right at the top of the hour. Just stay with us. We'll come back. We'll talk a little bit more and then take phone calls for the rest of the hour with Nick Rosen, author of the book, Off the Grid. Back in a moment. Okay, this hour we're going to take your phone calls with Nick Rosen as we talk about living off the grid. His work is called Off the Grid, and all his websites and Facebook links all linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Nick, years ago I had a 114-acre farm. I wish I still had. And I wish I knew what I know now about solar because I would have gone off the grid with that.
Where was the farm?
It was in Illinois. And, I bet it's worth 10 times what I paid for it at this point. Because, that was 20 years ago. Unbelievable. All gone.
110 acres is a lot of land, though. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I favor smaller plots. Unless you've got an extremely large family.
Right. Or friends.
Yeah.
What are some of your tips for living off the grid?
Keep it small. I think that's one of them. I think we've, as a culture, kind of overhoused ourselves over the last 25 years. Of course, space is always nice, but space has to be heated and cooled and maintained. So I'd say, build no larger a home than you need. Depending on, the size of your family and whether you work at home or not. And but choosing the right land is probably the critical factor. So obviously cost is the number one issue, and you're going to have to set a budget. But then you want land that's south-facing so that you've got your good growing areas and also good for solar panels. And you want to have water on the land, whether it's a creek or a borehole or a well. There's got to be some kind of water supply. And those cost money. I mean, people understand the value of water on land. You're not going to... There are a few bargains. But so the first advice is choose the right land. Make sure that there's some good arable land, some good land for growing, and a bit of woodland, some trees that you can both use as a source of wood and because a mixed kind of environment will allow you to grow what you need.
Okay, let's go to the phones now. Douglas in Houston, Texas. Hi, Douglas. Go ahead.
Hello, George. This is Douglas. I talked a while back to Dr. Ali. He's over GE's power generation department.
Okay.
And I came up with an idea that would cut the mechanical energy requirements to 1/3 to generate the same amount of power and on a generator. And they wouldn't sign a confidentiality agreement. His lawyer called me about an hour before we were supposed to meet and go over the plans and all that on this particular generator that I was making, and the idea and all, the drawings and so on.
Uh-huh.
And his lawyer called me about an hour beforehand, and he said that they would take all the information, but it would have to be without a confidentiality agreement because they wanted to evaluate the information first, and they might be working in that area and so on and so forth, and they didn't want to put themselves to production in that area, providing it coincided with what they might be already working on. And so Dr. Ali and I never met. And I had talked to Victor Fields' representative, Yuri. He's in Chicago, and I was going to have him a module to one of their magnetic field generation programs to show what I was going to do to make the generator work.
Well, you sound like you're Nikola Tesla in a sense, where you had this great plan, these great ideas, and you couldn't take it anywhere. But I guess, Nick, if they were working on something, too, they probably didn't want to be bound by a confidentiality statement, huh?
Well, first of all, Douglas, I'm glad you didn't go to the meeting without the confidentiality agreement. No, they could have signed a confidentiality agreement because those confidentiality agreements always ought to say something to the effect that if we can show you something in our files that we were already working on it, then there's no problem.
Exactly.
So, GE is a rough, tough old company. It didn't get where it is by being nice to people. And I'm glad you didn't see them. But you should but get in touch. I can introduce you to some energy entrepreneurs who would be happy to sign a confidentiality agreement. And, if you want to use offgrid.net as a platform to just talk without giving any details about what you're trying to achieve, you'll probably find there's some very interested people there who might even have some helpful ideas for you.
All right, great. Let's go next to Curtis in Maryland. You're up with us on Coast to Coast. Hi, Curtis.
Hey, George. Good to talk to you again. Regular call-in. Love talking to you guys on the show and listen every night on my paper route here in rural Maryland. Question for your guest is that I've been pushing the same thing about getting off the grid and talking about people putting up, solar panels and personal windmills and the possibility of taking it to the next level of community windmills, community solar farms. And since I've taken up that banner and started talking about it, it seems that there's a constituent of people or a group of people that think that the alternative power solar is there's no way that we could build enough of it to make a difference as far as the population is concerned. I'd like to know how your guest feels about that.
Okay. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, thank you for asking about that. And I think that there is a surprising resistance, even from within the environmental movement. And I think they're sort of afraid of looking marginal. They're afraid that if they start supporting local energy moves like this, they'll somehow kind of look a bit hokey. I'm only guessing because I don't really understand why there isn't a vast amount of support from the environmental movement for the off-grid movement. But to answer your question, it is going to get much, much easier to finance these sort of community energy initiatives. There are all sorts of people I met on my travels around America, mainly on the West Coast, but all over America. There are people who want to finance well-structured community energy initiatives. So if a community comes to them and says, we want to put up a big wind turbine, then you'll be able to get the finance for that, because the people who put it up know that if they can get the permission and they've got the land and they've got a customer base, they're going to have no problem shifting the rest of that energy and getting a return on their investment.
Nick, would you say you're getting support from organizations for this concept or not?
All sorts of support coming from all kinds of organizations, but just not from the mainstream big environmental groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. I mean, they're not negative, but they're just, rather restrained in their support, let's say.
Let's go to Sacramento, California now. Richard's turn, first-time caller. Hi, Richard.
Hello, gentlemen. My question is more, I guess, I've been interested in doing alternative energy myself, and I've looked into even doing training for myself, and the cost has been a bit much for my case. And I do a bit of tinkering. My question is in regards to hydro, and specifically micro hydro. Is that feasible? And I can go ahead and take my answer off the phone.
All right.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. Microhydro, if you're lucky enough to have some running water, microhydro is absolutely the best form of energy because it's continuous and reliable, until the creek dries up in the height of summer, perhaps. But at that point, your solar panels kick in anyway. So microhydro is great. If you're lucky enough to have a supply of water, running water is energy. It's inexpensive and simple to turn that into electricity. And you were talking about training. Please put an ad onto the Land Buddy section of Off-Grid saying who you are and where you are and what you'd like to do, because the best people to train you are the people who are already doing it. Don't go on some expensive course. Hook up with some other people who are doing it. Learn on the job with them. Become an apprentice, if you like. That's the way to do it. And that way we'll build up a community of people who are helping each other and getting each other off the grid.
Well, this percent that you said that it's growing at 15% a year, that's outstanding, isn't it?
It's pretty good. It's come down. It was growing at 30-40% a year, but from a small base. And inevitably, as the phenomenon gets larger and really gets traction, it's going to slow down because the bigger it is, the slower it'll grow. But yeah, it's pretty good. And I think it's going to pick up again, especially with heat waves like the one we're having at the moment. People are increasingly going to be forced to confront very large electricity bills and the need to do something about it.
Okay, let's go now to Houston, Texas again. Jan's turn. Go ahead, Jan.
Hey, George.
Hi.
A couple of questions for Nick. It was either in Who Killed the Electric Car or maybe it was a PBS documentary. There was an entrepreneurial couple, I think in their 70s, developing a type of solar panel, I guess you'd call it, with more like tar paper, where you could just cover your whole roof with it, but I don't think it was quite commercial yet. I wonder if Nick had heard of that, and also, I think it was, I don't know if it was you or Ian interviewed somebody within the past couple of years who was developing a tiny type of turbine for the roof, similar to those solar farms out in the California desert.
Right.
Mm.
I wonder if you had heard of that. And the other thing I was thinking, this off-the-grid movement seems to dovetail just perfectly with David Bloom and his, decentralized production of fuel.
Yeah, David would definitely be jumping all over for something like this, too. Are you partnering up at all, Nick, with any organizations that are backing you?
Well, we're completely independent. I mean, we've got alliances with all sorts of people, with eco groups around America, but we haven't got any partnerships at all. We're just independent, and we exist for the readers and subscribers, and that's what we're there for. But to answer your question, Bloom, of course, his big backer is John Doerr, the venture capitalist, who's another celebrity off-gridder, but, he has his bug-out location near Half Moon Bay in San Francisco. He's got a 2,000-acre ranch there that's full of that no doubt has a Bloom box to power it. There are a lot of new technologies for solar, and there is a kind of paper, something like a paper. I can't remember the name of the company anymore, but the cost is that it's less efficient. You get less energy per square foot. It's cheaper. It kind of sticks on, but there's less energy per square foot of roof space from that particular kind of solar panel at the moment. This is all like the internet 15 years ago. It's all developing as we speak, becoming more and more user-friendly and more plug-and-play as it goes along.
What happened to T. Boone Pickens' idea for windmills? Why did he back off all that?
Because it suffers from exactly the same problems as the existing energy system. Vast amounts of centralized energy that have to be transported around at great cost. A lot of maintenance, of course, as well, and a lot of unknown factors, to do with return on investment. But mainly, this old idea of centralizing production and shifting it around the country, it just doesn't make sense anymore. Much better to put your energy where the users are. It's just distributed energy. Again, it's an internet kind of idea. You have your energy production where you have your consumption. I'm sure that Google, with their vast server farms, which they're very secretive about, by the way, will be putting their server farms where the energy is. They won't be bringing the energy in. And, of course, they're one of the first customers for the Bloom box.
Next up, Santa Cruz, California. It's Joy's turn. Joy, good morning.
Good morning to both you and Rick. And hi, Rick. I actually knew people I think you're talking about up in Northern California. Greenfield Ranch.
Greenfield Ranch, exactly right, near Ukiah. That's
yes,
exactly right.
Exactly. Yeah. And I used to go up there all the time, and it's amazing how they've been able to survive up there by going off the grid. But I live on a cooperative in Santa Cruz County. Now, we have not gone off the grid yet, but we're working on it. We all want to. But we are doing permaculture. Mm-hmm. And everyone on the cooperative all does things to help work with the way that nature works to make things grow better and so we can be more self-sufficient. And I think that, George, I think you really should do some more programs on self-sufficiency.
Mm-hmm. You like them?
Because this is a way that we can all benefit from each other and communal living. And I'm not talking about communes. I'm talking about cooperatives. You know what I mean?
As you know, Catherine Austin Fitts, has her own theory of her permaculture almost the same way.
Well, it's working for us here. We just our biggest problem, Rick, is that we don't have enough sunshine coming in our mountain valley. Mm. So we have to find all kinds of alternative ways to make things work.
Like those big mirrors we were talking about, maybe one day.
Yeah, but getting them all on the mountain is fine, but bringing all the power down to the valley, you lose a lot of power that way.
Well, no, the mirrors would just reflect the sunlight straight onto your solar panels. But anyway, leaving that aside, I think permaculture is great because what it does is it tries to pair off different kinds of plants together so they help each other. And for people who are trying to feed themselves without spending a lot of money on expensive pesticides and fertilizers and so on, it's a very clever way of increasing productivity from the earth without spending any money.
Nick, are there some countries that are way more advanced than we are, for example, here in the United States in this area?
Well, it's often a case of ancient wisdom that we've kind of forgotten. So Eastern Europe, because they're still pretty poor in Eastern Europe, the standard of living there is rising, but they've got a very old culture. Lots of East Europeans went to settle in America. So a lot of them understand about curing and canning and growing and what you can grow and what you can pick and what you can eat. So Eastern Europe is one place where there's a similar culture, similar geography as well. The same sorts of things will grow.
Good point. Let's go to Oklahoma now. It's John's turn on Coast to Coast. Hi, John. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I live in an older home built in 1928, very inefficient. I have approximately 1,000 square foot internal space, of which only about 700 of it cannot be subdivided because there's no separating doors. My air conditioner went out a long time ago. I came with a house, about probably 20 years old. This last 3 or 4 weeks, we've been in a temperature rise of well over 95 degrees, which is, I guess, unusual. My house has never gotten below 90 degrees day and night. I go down to the basement, it's like 76. It's 6 feet below ground level. I think maybe what I should have done would have been to bought a house that was subterranean or at least earth shelter type home, where I could enjoy the benefits of the ground coolness and not have to try to provide my own air conditioning. Also, I have a
well, that is a great idea. Why don't you hold on, and I'll get the rest of you when we come back. On our next Coast to Coast program, Dr. Christian Von Leer joins us as we talk about the history of Atlantis and how it ties into 2012 prophecies. That'll be our next Coast to Coast show. When we come back, we'll take final phone calls with Nick Rosen right here on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. Let's go back to John in Oklahoma. John, you were saying, obviously, down in your basement, much cooler than being up there, huh?
Well, I would, but I have a gas water heater down there, and I'm almost killed by gas heaters before that were malfunctioning, not working efficiently. And I'm really paranoid almost about being right in the same airspace with them. The people next door now, they are living in their basement. They have a full basement, and they moved down into their basement for the summertime. I don't think the solar panels are particularly practical here in Enid area, Midwest, because I never see any. And the reason why I don't is because we have such terrible hailstorms here. We had 4 1/4-inch hailstones in Oklahoma City here about a month ago, and that's a softball size. That would have easily destroyed any array of solar panels. But I think maybe they might be usable if the solar panels were all placed on pivots. You know what I mean? End-to-end pivots, so they could be turned 90 degrees and have a steel pan on the bottom side that would help protect the panel itself from direct impact from the hailstones. At least during the thunderstorm period, and then they could be rotated back face up. Also, in order not to have to use so much energy to heat water, I think it was the Romans that actually used copper piping to pipe their water up onto the roof and use the benefit of the heat from the sun to heat up the water for bathing and other purposes like that. We could do that, and that would be not only efficient but very inexpensive to do. The city of Enid is in the process right now of planning with the local electric company, I think it's OG&E, to build a wind turbine electric generating plant just a few miles, like 10 miles or so outside of Enid, to service the Enid area, which is another very intelligent idea, I think, rather than trying to use a nationwide grid.
Pretty good ideas, I would think. What do you think about the idea to shelter the solar panels, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, huge hailstones isn't a problem I've come across before, but it's an interesting one. I mean, those solar panels are pretty hardy, I mean, the first ones that were built 25 years ago are still going strong and don't seem to have suffered any loss of efficiency, and they were developed for the space program. I mean, it was NASA that first used the solar panels. So they're pretty tough things, but yes, I can imagine that they would get pretty bad battering, and the glass might break, and that would reduce their efficiency.
Oh, absolutely.
But I should think they would still work even after a hailstorm, and the technology does already exist to pivot them because, of course, they can follow the sun better that way. But I'm sorry to hear about your house. I agree with you about the water heating. There's not much you can do about a badly designed house from the energy point of view. I mean, I don't mean that it's badly designed to live in, but just from the energy point of view. That is part of the kind of conspiracy that went on at the beginning of the 20th century between the electricity companies and everybody else to get people to use more power.
Do you think they were just inefficient, stupid, or do you really think that they were trying to force you to actually use more power?
There's absolutely no doubt. I've got a whole chapter in the book just about the history. There's no doubt they were trying to get us to use more power. When Edison first started selling light to the people of Manhattan, he sold light. He didn't sell them power. He said, I will light your house. I think he charged so much per room or per light bulb. But after a very short time, he switched to metering the electricity. And at that point, of course, the energy industry, the electricity industry, lost all incentive to encourage energy efficiency. Their job was to sell as much electricity as possible. And that meant their job was to sell us inefficient appliances.
I remember during my days growing up in Detroit that the power company, probably was Edison, gave away light bulbs for free.
Absolutely. And, and they were probably fairly inefficient light bulbs. They were probably 100 watts or more.
Exactly.
And, but of course, when it first started, when electricity first started being piped into people's homes, it was a fantastic innovation, and light was all that people really wanted. And the electricity companies were kind of scratching their heads and wondering how can they get people to use more electricity. And they hired a brilliant marketing man who came up with that slogan, "Make your house a home." And they had photographs of American families clustered around the radio and around the electric fire. And they started creating products that would use more electricity. So the washing machine was a very important product. And there was a big movement against the washing machine. And a lot of the big women's magazines campaigned against the washing machine and said that it didn't really save much labor because you'd still had to hang the washing up and take it in and put it out. But it just put a lot of people out of work, the people who'd done your washing up till now. And what it did was it kind of it increasingly pushed things back into the private home. So instead of services like washing or delivery of fresh food like milk and meat, people had fridges, so they didn't need deliveries. People had washing machines, so they didn't need local washing services. And it just made the house, the unit. And the electricity industry was very important in that development.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Syracuse, New York we go. John, it's your turn. Hi, John.
Thank you, George, for doing this.
Sure thing.
Mr. Rosen, I want to let you know that National Grid in upstate New York on the shores of Lake Ontario from Syracuse to Rochester own the power lines, Mr. Rosen. National Grid is owned by the British.
Correct.
They want to own the power lines from coast to coast. But your discussion with Mr. Norrie today is interesting for one factor. You wrote a book on this national efficiency of power and electricity, which is being manipulated from 2 points. The first point is separate companies want to own the grid, but they want to own the power lines only and call it transmission. Then they want to have a separate entity, which is the generation stations. So when you receive your electric bill and look at it, you were charged for the power lines that have been paid for 10 times over. And now you want to have a separate part of your bill, which is called power choice. I could go out and even make my own generation station, but I could go out and select the power that I want to buy anywhere in the United States and have it transmitted through those lines and be charged a line fee and be charged a transmission fee. Or if I make my own power, as you suggested, try to go off the grid, the power company, owned by the British again, will not let me go off the grid because they want to sell any excess power that I make at my house back onto the grid and credit my bill for it, and at the same time still charge me a transmission fee if it's coming in or going out. It's the greatest manipulation that's ever taken place. It is one other factor that I hope your book recognizes to people. Even though the power company, which is owned by the British, called National Grid, is charging you a transmission fee, that fee is greater than the generation stations that are powering. And you know the physics of electricity. You can't transmit, Mr. Rosen, unless you generate. So it's all a scam.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with an awful lot of what you said. I mean, the electricity industry in America is a $400 billion a year business. And they spend an awful lot of money on lobbying and on keeping their profile nice and low so we just don't think about them too often. And one of the biggest scams they are operating is this issue of electricity transmission. We're actually producing more energy than we really need in America. And a lot of it is made, and the reason that they get permission to build the power plants is because they point at the peak load. They need to always have enough power to deal with the peak load. So the higher the peak, the more energy they can produce during the off-peak times. And that energy they produce in the off-peak times gets sent around the country and bought and sold. And, of course, eventually we pay for it. You know, somebody's profit, it goes onto our bill eventually for the transmission. National Grid, British company, active in New Hampshire, New York, and a number of other states. In New Hampshire, the energy companies have lobbied the New Hampshire authorities so that if you're a very ill person who cannot exist without electricity, they're allowed to turn off your electricity if you don't pay the bill. And recently, I'm talking about June 2010, a lady in New Hampshire died because National Grid shut off her electricity. Even though they knew she was ill, she'd filled in the right forms, they came round, they knocked on the door, she was on her respirator, couldn't get up, so they shut off her electricity and she died. And they said the reason was she hadn't renewed her permission, which she's supposed to do every 60 days. Well, the governor of New Hampshire is now looking into it, and I'm sure they'll change the rules and tighten them up. But that is the sort of lobbying power that the electricity industry has, and that's what makes it essential that we stand up and fight it. And going off the grid is the best way to fight it.
Couple more calls to go here. John in Baltimore, Maryland. It's your turn. Hi, John. Go ahead.
Good morning. Hang on one second.
Sure.
I wanted to just make a quick comment and tell you that Abu Dhabi is building a green city, fully recyclable, fully solar, all the way around. And I wanted to ask a question. I heard you mention water is electricity. I have a little stream in my backyard. I'm actually brainstorming getting an alternator, trying to get some kind of paddle wheel maybe to spin this and create some electricity for my house. Is that possible?
It's absolutely possible. You don't need to build anything, though. I mean, you know, for $100 or a couple of $100 at the most, you can just get a little generator that you just literally dip into the water. You don't have to do much more than that. I mean, you've got to have something to hold it in place.
Wow, that's it.
That will produce electricity, and you don't want to be traveling that electricity too far. Though, you know, if it's a long way from the stream to your house, you've got a problem.
Not too far. It's about 100 feet. Is that too far?
No, that's fine. 100 feet is fine.
Because my house was built in the late 40s. I mean, there was a 30-amp panel in the house when we first moved in. It upgraded to 100, of course. But
yeah.
I'm thinking at 30 amps, there's not much power in my house to begin with. I think I could create my own.
No, it sounds perfect. So you're not dependent on lots of energy-guzzling devices. So you could quite possibly live, a lot of the year round with just that energy that you're going to be able to generate from your stream.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Masdar, the problem with Masdar, by the way, which is that town in Abu Dhabi that you were talking about, the interesting thing about Masdar is that one of the oil states has decided they need to invest in, a renewable energy city. So even they realize that the oil is coming to an end. But the problem with it is that they're setting it up to be kind of like a super consumer place where everybody is allowed to guzzle as much energy as possible. So ultimately, I'm not quite sure how eco it is, but at least it's a step in the right direction.
Okay, let's go now to Michael in Arkansas, first-time caller. Michael, good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
Hi.
I'm calling to ask a question about renting solar panels program. My girlfriend and I just recently bought a house out here to try to give a more sustainable environment for our boy to grow up in. And we were looking into there's a program that was available around here where you actually basically pay like a monthly rental fee and you get some solar panels to put up on your roof. People come and they do the maintenance and whatnot on them. Much less cost than buying and installing your own solar panels. But for that monthly fee, basically, you're cutting your energy consumption by a large portion, and all the maintenance and whatnot is all taken care of on your behalf. That program was canceled, though. I was wondering if you knew of any equivalent programs that were still available or anything along those lines.
Well, I'm sorry to hear the program got cancelled because it is a good idea, and I expect that. And of course, this is all new stuff. It's all happening now, and I would love to team up with a business and start just that kind of a program right across America and help people go off grid on a really large scale. If anybody's listening who wants to get in touch, please do via the website offgrid.net. To answer your question, it depends on the area you're in, but I'm sure that something will come along because it makes such sense as a business model that the householder wants to kind of future-proof. There's this technology, it's changing fast. You might buy the wrong thing. So better to rent, have somebody else take care of the maintenance, at least for the next few years, as the technology gets cheaper, and then eventually you buy. Of course, you want to make sure that you're renting at a price which is lower than your electricity bill currently is.
Let's go to Martine, Wilmington, North Carolina. Hi, Martine.
Oh, good morning. This is an exciting show. I wanted you both to be aware that there's a wonderful company in North Carolina called the Inertia, ENERTIA building system. Michael Sykes is the inventor. Many of these houses are solar-powered as well. But the magic to these houses is that in their construction, they don't require heaters or air conditioners to remain comfortable year-round. One of your earlier callers was talking about going to the basement. And essentially, there are 5 ancient technologies that are used in building these homes, and one of the technologies is berming 3 sides of the house.
So three sides of the house?
It's bermed on 3 sides of the house. The southern exposure is the power generator in terms of keeping the building comfortable.
Yeah. Well, I often talk about living off the grid as combining ancient wisdom and new technology, and you're talking about the ancient wisdom bit. And it's very good stuff, and it can be very very cost-effective financially to build in that way. And again, it's technologies that we've lost since the grid came along.
How do you plan your journey across the U.S. to meet people? How do you coordinate your plans?
It wasn't very coordinated. It was just sort of luck and happenstance.
Really?
Somebody in one place would tell me of a friend in another place, and I would sort of rush down to Big Bend, Texas, because I met someone in Austin who told me to go there. Big Bend was an amazing community with very, very inexpensive land. I mean, really cheap land, but of course, very tough land to live on. A lot of people just moving on in trailers, people who've been foreclosed in the Northeast, just moving on down and setting up their new life.
Well, it is. It's something I think that is long overdue, Nick, and more and more people seem to be interested in this, aren't they?
They really are. There's a real desire, there's a yearning for this at the moment, a yearning for freedom, for a way of getting out from under the thumb of the man, and of course the environmental aspect is important. A lot of people want to do something to help the environment.
Absolutely. Well, Nick, thanks for being on the program. I appreciate it. Good luck with it. Thank you
very much for inviting me. It's been really interesting. Your questions and the listeners' questions were really good.
Off the Grid, where do you get the book?
You can get it on Amazon, Off the Grid, Inside the Movement for More Space, less government, and true independence in modern America.
You got it. Thanks again, Nick. I really appreciate you being on the program. Great information. For Dan Galante, Jason King, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladouceur, Stephanie Smith, Ross Mitchell, George Knapp, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell, I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.